This is a review of a Thaitsuki nohonto Sanmai Katana. A brief disclosure before beginning. This sword is owned by a friend of mine. It's not mine, not my property, but I'm allowed to do a review on it because I'm cool like that, I guess. Additionally, this sword is one specific instance and may not represent every product Thaitsuki has ever made, but it is the only thing that I have to give you my thoughts on. Keep in mind that these are just my thoughts and opinions. First, a bit about Thaitsuki, because most people don't know much about them, myself included. In fact, I don't even know if I'm saying the name correctly. But I'm going to call it Thaitsuki, so bear with me, and feel free and correct me in the comments below if there's a better pronunciation or I'm misleading in some way. Thaitsuki nohonto is supposedly run by a family who's been making swords for 400-ish years. Based on the information on their website, their lineage started somewhere around 1590 when samurai were stationed in Thailand. They've been making swords there, supposedly again ever since. I've heard some folks say that the forge is also a Japanese shrine of some sorts, but I don't really know the validity behind those stories. If it is, that may bring some sort of similarity to other Japanese swords that were produced, as some of them were produced in shrines. In any event, they're produced in Thailand. The Thaitsuki website describes their swords as the finest production-level Japanese swords we've ever seen, and without a doubt, these are the finest Japanese swords currently available. I respectfully disagree, and I will elaborate further. From what I can tell, this specific Thaitsuki nohonto katana is the Thaitsuki Dokuji Nami Sanmai katana, or S02, their higher-end iteration of swords. That said, the version on their website does look a little bit different. This one has a purple saya, or scabbard, but the version on their website is blue. This sword retails for $3,000, or to be specific, $2,999, and sells for $2,099 on Cult of Athena or on Thaitsuki's website if it happens to be on sale. Now I'll ramble on a little bit more about each part of the sword. I'll talk about the fittings first, and when I say fittings, I mean the fuchi, kashira, minuki, and suba. For those non-Japanesey swordy type folks, the fuchi, kashira, minuki, and suba are what would be the upper cap of the handle, the pommel, or what is not really a pommel, but like a pommel. The minuki are the little adornments or decorations underneath the wrapping, and the suba is the handguard. The fittings on this sword are very pleasant to look at, frankly. They seem very well made, and for a production level sword, I would say they stand out as a cut above. In fact, they're my favorite part of this sword. The Thaitsuki website says that they're handmade, and frankly, I believe it. They don't have an overwhelming amount of detail, but the detail that they have is enough to stand out as frankly, better than what I've seen on most production katana, even in a high-end standpoint. I like that the pieces aren't cast, personally. Even though they might be a little more rudimentary, the fact that they're not cast seems to have a little bit more finesse to me. That's subjective, maybe you don't care if they're cast, but the fact that somebody whittled away at these with a chisel, I find more appealing than something that was cast. Now granted, whether or not you like that is very subjective. Maybe it doesn't matter to you, but the other thing I'll note about these fittings is that they seem very reminiscent of Edo period or other Japanese fittings that I've seen that are actually genuine fittings. So I think they are very similar to what you would actually aspire to get on a Japanese style sword, or at least in a basic sense. The theme on this sword is a wave type theme, and I think they hit the mark pretty well on a Japanese wave type theme. It seems like it could very well be Edo period, or at least Japanese artistically influenced type fittings. They didn't go way overboard, but honestly, if you like the theme or not is very subjective. I think they hit the mark pretty hard on the fittings, and without a doubt, it is my favorite part of this sword. The suka and ito. Again, for my non-Japanese sword-related folks that are watching, the suka is the handle, and the ito is the wrap around that handle. Now, a Japanese sword handle is made up of a lot of different parts, and I'm going to elaborate on why I don't particularly like this suka and ito. The shape of the suka honestly isn't terrible, but the rest of it is, and let me elaborate a little bit on that. The ito is made of a nice material, and the wrap has nice small diamonds, but the diamonds are uneven. The ito is also very loose, and very, very loose. I mean, honestly, this thing would make me pretty nervous about use. I think it would almost come unraveled after several uses. I have not had a katana from anyone with ito this loose before. It almost seems childish. Despite the loose wrap, you can still see the edge of the panels on the samegawa. The nodules on the samegawa are also relatively small. The peg placement or makugi placement on the sword also seem a little bit odd. One is rather hard to get at, and one is also placed at a kind of an odd angle. Frankly, for a sword this expensive, I would like to see a little bit better samegawa panel used. I don't know if the tsuka comes off easily or is cracked or not, and unfortunately I'm not able to find that information out. This is not my sword, as I've mentioned, and I don't want to overstep my bounds. The owner was very generous to allow me to borrow this sword for the purposes of this review, and I really don't want to irritate him by taking the tsuka off, as it may mar up the Mikugi and make it look a little bit odd, or it might not come off very easily and it might not go back together the same way. That's always a risk you take when you disassemble one of these production swords. On any note, what I can say is I don't believe the tsuka is cracked. It doesn't creak when I move it around, and other than the Ito being loose and the Kashira being loose, the rest of it seems relatively tight. The tsuka doesn't wiggle, the tsuba doesn't wiggle, there's no other wiggles or waggles anywhere else. The habaki on this sword is also really nice. I would constitute this almost part of the fittings, and it goes in line with fitting into what I think is probably one of my favorite parts of this sword. It seems very well formed, it's done in silver, it has a really classy look and some decorative embellishments that suit the sword really well in my opinion. It also doesn't wiggle around, and honestly it fits really well. It also fits the koiguchi area really well. You can turn the sword upside down and it doesn't fall out of the scabbard, so it fits well. This sword has also been on a shelf for a long time, hasn't been used, so obviously it's not worn out, but the fact that humidity and temperature changes over time haven't affected it is a good sign. The saya is also pretty well done in some ways. And in that way I mean the lacquer job is pretty nice. It's a nice, thick, clear lacquer that seems durable. The sword also draws nicely. I don't hear the katana wiggling around if I put it in the saya and give it a shake, and that suggests that this saya was actually made for this sword and not produced ahead of time. Maybe it was and they just got the fit down, but a lot of times on production swords, even high-end ones, when the sword's sheathed in the saya, I can shake it and I can hear the tip rattling around in there. That can be a bit of a bummer because if that happens, your sword can rub on the saya as it's transported or moved around, and that can blemish the polish. I don't see that as a problem in this one. Unfortunately, the saya is also really thick. The koiguchi area is hefty, and aesthetically, it doesn't really match the fuchi. It gives a very strange look, frankly. Most often, the fuchi and the koiguchi, think of that as the top of the handle and where the sword goes in, are supposed to match in size a little bit closer. It's not supposed to be such a drastic jump from small to large. It throws the eye off and it is aesthetically unpleasant. On the flip side, it's less likely to break and has a little more protection than average. If you're nervous about using it for draw cuts, the extra thickness might act as insurance against cutting your fingers off. That can happen, by the way, sometimes when you're doing a draw cut from a samurai sword. If you pull the sword out and it's at a bad angle, the sword can cut through the saya and into your hand. That's a real bummer. The extra thickness might not be a bad thing for a practitioner, but still, I think the aesthetic looks a little bit weird, and from my understanding, it's just not supposed to look this way, even from a practitioner standpoint. The blade. There's really a lot to look at and a lot to talk about, and honestly, there's a lot to like and a lot not to like. It's a weird contrast in that way. The blade has a nice, wide cutting profile, and it looks like it'll do the grass cutting job pretty well, at least if your intention is to cut tatami mats with it. The blade has very little niku. Think of that as the apple seed shape of the blade. It doesn't have a lot of meat on the bone there, and that seems a little bit odd, but it's not exactly unheard of in the production sword market. The blade is a very pleasant hata, and the bohi seems well done. It seems well executed at both ends, but there's a slight difference between where they both terminate. It's minimal, but notable. The flats of the blade are very smooth, and the lines seem clean for a production sword or even a custom sword, at least in this price point. They're not perfect, but I would describe them as better than most production swords that I've seen, even on the higher end scale. The polish is also nice because it's not a simple mirror polish. A little bit more attention was given to bringing out the hata and the hamon. Unfortunately, the kisaki is just not good. Not good by almost any polishing standard. I've seen really cheap swords that have a better defined yakote being kind of the definition line where the kisaki starts, the kisaki being the tip of the sword. The burnishing is just off. The yakote is not really there, and it'd be one thing if that was intentional, but it looks like they tried and failed. I would not say it's a big deal, but I mean honestly this is a very expensive sword, and on this type of sword, if they're trying to put a yakote on to make the kisaki look very defined and pleasant, I think they missed the mark almost entirely on this one. Missing the kisaki is an enormous part of the blade polish. Some people say that the kisaki is the part that you show the world. In fact, if you're having your sword drawn, you're always pointing your kisaki at your opponent's face. It's what they see, and if you want to impress them, it better look nice. Handling wise, the sword feels stout in the hand. It's a sizable blade, but it still feels good. It's not necessarily amazing feeling, but it does feel good, better than most production swords of its size and stature. It feels a bit like somebody thought about how the sword should feel in the hand and did a pretty good job hitting the mark. I'm not going to handle it much, but from what I have done, I have to say that it feels like it should. The thing is, I can't say if it's a good cutting blade. I can't say it because it's not mine, and I can't cut with it without the owner probably filleting me alive. I can't say if it'll bend easy, I don't know if it'll chip, I don't know if it'll do the job. The owner of the sword did cut once with the blade and said he didn't have any particular concerns with it and it seemed to do a good job, but wanted to improve in his technique before pursuing any cutting with this sword or a sword of this price point any further. The sword seems like it's profiled to do the job well enough though, so I can't really say that it seems like it would be a bad cutter, and I certainly wouldn't be apprehensive about using it on harder targets if it were mine. In terms of handling though, the blade does feel a little bit too stout to be used for Aido, so I think it's a little bit more of a dedicated cutter or something that you're going to have around to keep as an aesthetic piece or a conversation piece or a wall hanger, unfortunately. Not that it is a wall hanger, but aesthetically at this price, not a lot of people are going to cut with it. Or maybe a lot of people are going to cut with it. I don't know. The final thought that I would add to handling though is that if you do intend on cutting with the sword, I would plan on getting the handle rewrapped in short order. I've had swords with loose Ito before, and when you're doing cutting with the sword, the Ito can come undone, the kashira can come off, it can come unraveled kind of easily, and they don't go back together. You have to have them rewrapped, and I would plan on doing that if I were the owner of this sword. The end question is it worth it? And that's a question that's really hard to answer, considering I haven't cut with it. So that's really a big determining factor. Now, the previous owner has cut once with it and didn't really have any particular complaints about it. But I haven't. So I don't know if the blade's going to chip or roll or bend really easily. I don't know if it's going to take a set really simply, and that's a pretty big factor to if it's worth it. But just off what I'm seeing, I would still say no. Even if it cut like a dream, I would still say no. And the reason is this. Basically, it's competing in a really high-end threshold, and for $2,100 or $2,900 or $3,000, if you want to spend more money than you need to, there's a lot of options on the table. You have really high-end options from Citadel, you have options from Kanei, I'm probably saying the name wrong, you have options from Hanwei and their L6 series or the Paper Crane if you can get a hold of one. You have options from Dynasty Forge and their Daimyo series. There's a lot of high-end production katanas, but admittedly, none of them really fit the exact same category as this sword. And the reason for that is this. While you might find swords that are made with a traditional construction, very few things are made with a traditional type construction in terms of folded steel and a Sanmai type construction, but very few of them have custom fittings as well. And if that's something that you want, then your options can be limited. For example, the Hanwei Paper Crane and the Dynasty Forge Daimyo series, those are probably the closest apples to apples comparisons that I could give you, but they're different. Both of them, I believe, feature some sort of cast type fitting, so not custom handmade. The Citadel katanas have some handmade fittings, but they're mono steel blades. So there's not necessarily something that gives you custom kind of handmade fittings along with a traditional construction, a polish that shows off the hata and hamon relatively well, all in kind of one package in the higher end spectrum. There are things that attempt to do that for like $400 or $500, but we're talking about something at a different price threshold. And really, if we're doing apples to apples, there's not anything that necessarily has the same features as this. But for $2,100, you're also competing with custom swords. Now you can get a finished custom sword for about $2,100 from some smiths out there, but again, it's probably not going to be a folded steel. There are also a lot of options that are available with a buy it now button on eBay that are actual genuine nohonto that are finished and ready to go. They're tough to find. You have to be kind of on the nose and have money available and luck of the draw type thing, but they are available and do come up. There's also Shinsakudos that are available in that price point that are finished. I know because I'm selling one for $2,300 and it's a genuine Japanese-made blade with a better Ito wrap than this, though admittedly the one I'm selling has an antique Tsuba, but the fittings are not all handmade. So it's tough to do an exact apples to apples comparison, but if I were saying, even if it cut like a dream, $2,100 still seems too much for this blade. Now, most of that is because of the flaws that I'm seeing. If it were perfectly executed, then my tune would probably change a little bit, and so if anyone from Thaitsuki is listening, Loose Ito at a price category here is really, this would concern me in such a way that if I actually used the blade, it would come loose pretty quickly. I could see, you know, after a couple good cuts, this kashra being torn off and the whole thing loosening up pretty substantially, and that doesn't seem cool, that you're almost expected to have the sword rewrapped after, you know, a couple rounds of cutting. At least that's what I would think would happen. Also, small nodule samegawa and panels at this price, I would certainly like to see a full wrap. It's not mandatory, but it would definitely be a perk. The large shaped koiguchi and fuchi here, this kind of thing, from a practitioner standpoint, it's great that you might not cut your hands, but it looks a little bit odd, and I think it could be more refined, especially for the money. The kasaki and how it's polished, not cool. I mean, when there are $100 swords that have a more defined kasaki and polish, I think you could spend the extra hour to define the kasaki better. Now, I'm dogging on it pretty hard here. It still is not a ripoff. I'll say that. If they are making these by hand and they want to pay livable wages, even in Thailand, with what you're getting and the amount of time that goes into it, I don't think $2,100 is a ripoff. I just think that there are a lot of better options out there. That's just one man's opinion, though. You're certainly welcome to your own, but I would rather have some other mono steel swords. I would rather have a different higher end production sword if I was doing cutting. I would rather honestly have a Japanese made Shinsakudo. I would rather have something with with a handle that I wasn't worried about coming undone. There's a lot of other things that I would personally say are money better spent, but make up your own mind. Hopefully this review gave you enough information to at least think about your buying decision in a different light. I know I didn't get to cut with this. Hopefully one day I'll get some video of the owner actually cutting with it, but he says he wants to practice a little bit more before he cuts with something this expensive again. But the one cut that he did do with it, he didn't have any complaints. So I hope that was helpful. Cheers, and thanks for watching.